Welcome to another episode of Husch Blackwell's False Claims Act Insights podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Porter. I'm fascinated by how the healthcare industry works in our country. Around a quarter of the entire federal government's budget is on healthcare, which is just a staggering number. And you might think that if we're going to spend $2 trillion on something, we'd have a well-defined system of what's okay and what's not. But we don't. There is so much gray area in healthcare, so many flexible concepts, so much conduct that is arguably okay and arguably not okay. I try really hard in my job to not get lost in the weeds, and so I force myself to zoom out every now and then and try to figure out why things are the way they are, why things are enforced the way they are, why things are regulated the way they are. And every time I do that in healthcare, I find myself just in disbelief that this is the system we chose, that we seem to be okay spending trillions of dollars of taxpayer money with very few clear, bright line rules, but a whole lot of murky ones based on discretionary concepts. It's fascinating / frustrating to practice in this space. So Congress sensed that these murky rules and gray areas were not super helpful to the industry back about 30 years ago and created a law as part of HIPAA that allowed HHS-OIG, which is the law enforcement arm of the Department of Health and Human Services. It allowed OIG to guide the healthcare industry in written advice on several of the murkiest of healthcare laws. And so for decades now, HHS-OIG has issued advisory opinions that are intended to clear things up. But advisory opinions aren't always what they seem. And so on today's episode of the podcast, we're talking about how the healthcare industry tries to get it right and how it should view OIG advisory opinions when trying to chart a compliant course. I've asked two super smart friends to join the episode to talk these things through. First is Brett McNeil. Brett is the Chief Legal Officer of CAN Community Health, a nonprofit healthcare organization operating in 6 states and providing a wide range of healthcare services with super complex regulations like a 340B pharmacy, which those who practice in that space know there's a lot of complexity there. I'm sure that occupies a lot of Brett's time. So Brett and I worked together as vice chairs of the American Health Law Association's Fraud and Abuse Practice Group, where Brett tolerated my musings on healthcare enforcement for a long time. And so I'm excited that Brett is going to join the podcast and share his thoughts on how healthcare providers can keep an organization on track when dealing with sometimes less than clear rules and regulations. And our second guest is my friend, David Traskey. David is a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of the law firm Garfunkel Wild, where David advises clients on a range of enforcement and compliance issues. Before that, David was senior counsel in HHS-OIG, where David implemented civil monetary penalties and helped OIG expand its use of data analytics. Really important stuff. And David and I left DOJ about the same time that David left OIG. And so we've kept in touch over the last couple of years to talk about this big shift to private practice and how healthcare enforcement works. And so I'm excited that David will give us an inside peek into the world of HHS-OIG today on the podcast. So Brett and David, I'm excited about this episode. Thank you both for joining me to talk about the complex world of healthcare and the role that HHS-OIG advisory opinions play in those efforts.
Thanks for having me.
Likewise. Looking forward to it.
All right. So as we said, healthcare is complicated. There's a lot of gray area, a lot more than people realize. So Brett, why don't you get us started by telling our listeners how you go about figuring out what's okay and what's not okay, and what role OIG advisory opinions play in those efforts?
Sure. I think for me, I start with the fundamentals, and it's probably not a whole lot different from any healthcare regulatory lawyer. The first two things I think about in any kind of arrangement or thing that's going to come across my desk. First question is, are federal program dollars involved? Usually that's pretty cut and dry and easy to deal with. The second thing I think about once that's answered in the affirmative is kind of mapping out the nature of the arrangement. And I have this, I'm a bit old school, I suppose, where I have a habit of taking a piece of paper and I diagram out all of the parties, and I have little arrows pointing to where the business is being generated, who's in control of the money, and the rest of it. So I start with the fundamentals there. And I've been very fortunate in my career to work with a lot of really good folks who the North Star of the question always is, how do we just help people? The economics matter, but the North Star of the question always is, how do we just help people? And once you get through the fundamentals, you kind of think through, my at least analytical algorithm kind of starts with, okay, if the first two things are both yeses, then is there a safe harbor that's involved? We're talking about a Stark issue, a kickback issue, and the rest of it. Where the advisory opinions really come into play is it provides a number of really good goalposts for me to keep in mind. And it's somewhat of an iterative process, I would say. Usually, as I'm acquiring facts from the client, I'm doing all sorts of different bits of analyses in my head. And as this is going on, I'm also being able to consult with the advisory opinions to see what back patterns, which things are particular salience to the OIG. So those kind of things all kind of get meshed together. And the advisory opinions for a very long time have been a really good source of guidance that I'm able to kind of synthesize into my practice and provide my clients with, here's what the chief enforcers of these programs have in mind. And they certainly take that into heart as well.
Thanks, Brett. That's helpful background. I think there's a lot of people just like you who take a very thoughtful approach to these things, where the North Star is, how do we help people and how do we do this in a compliant way? That, I think, is the vast majority of people in healthcare. I think there are very few people who go into this saying, my North Star is, I want to get profits and who cares if we get investigated. That's something that I tell DOJ lawyers a lot, is these are people who are trying to get it right. And so if you think that something bad happened here, let's talk about why you think that and whether that's an intentional thing or are we just assuming some bad motive that's not proper. But I love that you said that you break out arrows. So I do that all the time. I think about where business is coming from, where referrals are coming from, and I try to figure out, are there dollars going back? Is there an opposite arrow going back with a dollar sign that is rewarding those referrals? I think that's something that we should be teaching younger healthcare lawyers when they're thinking about kickbacks and Stark, is you have arrows pointing opposite ways, referrals coming one way, dollars going the other. So really good points, Brett. All right, David, Brett mentioned OIG advisory opinions, how he uses those. David, do you want to tell us what OIG advisory opinions really are and what does OIG put in these advisory opinions? Tell us the backstory of the process that OIG takes to issue these opinions.
Yeah, sure. I will tell you, I'll start by saying I am encouraged that there are other fellow artists out there. When I joined OIG many, many years ago, that was actually one of the first skills that I learned, was to do the diagram, to break out the legal pad and draw the boxes and draw the parties and draw the arrows and see what was going on to make sure, or to see whether or not there was any sort of an impermissible kickback or other type of beneficiary inducement. And it's a skill that I still use today. Sounds like much like you guys. The advisory opinions are funny beasts, right? I think they're both the cause of and the solution to sometimes the headaches that we experience as healthcare regulatory attorneys. But as you mentioned, Jonathan, the issuance of these advisory opinions is mandated through HIPAA and through the Social Security Act. And really, the whole purpose of these advisory opinions was to provide guidance to, at least initially, the parties that were requesting the guidance, right? And so the focus of these advisory opinions typically is on the applicability of the federal anti-kickback statute, any safe harbor provisions, and certain other administrative sanction authorities under the civil monetary penalties law as it relates to either actual or proposed arrangements that various parties want to enter into. That's the box that these advisory opinions fit in terms of what is their focus. The advisory opinions themselves, though, are legally binding on HHS and also the parties that are requesting the opinions. OIG publishes a redacted form of these opinions and posts them on their website. And, interestingly enough, they're always sort of rife with disclaimers saying that the opinions are for informational purposes only. No third parties are bound by these opinions or may legally rely on these advisory opinions. And I think that kind of puts the provider community in a tough spot, right? Because on one hand, the advisory opinions are very helpful, as Brett mentioned, in sort of providing rules of the road or goalposts or guideposts for you as you're thinking about how to fashion certain arrangements. On the other hand, their reliance only goes so far because the government would say, unless you are the requester of the opinion, the same protections that the requester might enjoy don't extend to other folks. So I think that's sort of interesting. And also what I would say is that in the last few years, OIG has sort of revised its regulations to remove some hurdles and to kind of promote transparency. It used to be that OIG would not issue advisory opinions on the same or substantially the same actions that were under investigation by different government entities. In 2022, they removed that hurdle, again, sort of in the interest of promoting flexibility and transparency. So they're sort of making some adjustments, I think, to the process. And I do think, like Brett said, that they are still really valuable pieces of the puzzle to help you figure out how to stay on the straight and narrow when it comes to fashioning these types of arrangements. I think it's also worth noting that advisory opinions are totally voluntary, and the failure to not get an advisory opinion cannot be introduced into evidence to prove that a particular party violated the law.
Yeah, thanks, David. They are voluntary, but I can't tell you how many times I've been in a DOJ office talking about something and explaining how complicated it is, and the DOJ lawyer to say, well, you could have gotten an advisory opinion. You're legally correct. That does not stop DOJ attorneys from playing that card. And I think, Dave, what's interesting is you mentioned how advisory opinions really only bind OIG and HHS and the party that requested it. So other people really can't rely on these advisory opinions, even though they're publicly available. They're published so that people can know about them. And I think everyone knows people look at these advisory opinions and try to figure out, what do we do? We're dealing with some sort of hard area. Is there an apples to apples situation out there where OIG has spoken on something? And of course, people rely on that. People are making educated decisions. And in my book, AKS is still a willfulness statute that you can only violate if you have a bad mindset, a mindset to break the law. And if you're doing something that OIG has said is okay in a different spot, I think that's meaningful, but other people disagree with me. But also, what a lot of people may not realize is there's gamesmanship that happens with OIG advisory opinions. You can seek an advisory opinion, find out the high-level answer, and then pull your request back so that you don't actually get the answer. I think that's really interesting. And people also may not know that it's not uncommon for someone to call out wrongdoers by submitting advisory opinion requests on what their competitor is doing. I think that's super, super interesting. So, David, start us off by telling a little bit about this gamesmanship with OIG advisory opinions. And then, Brett, I want to know whether you think that there are better ways for the healthcare industry to get some more certainty on what's okay and what's not.
Yeah, so it is really interesting, right? I think that typically, let's take a step back for a minute and just say, how do you even go about requesting the opinion, right? So requests for advisory opinions, they have to be submitted in PDF format, special email address that OIG requires that you use. And in an effort to try to simplify the process, OIG has also created this advisory opinion template to try to get folks who are requesting these opinions to provide information that they're going to want upfront to kind of cut back on any delays. And, as part of this process, you've got to identify who the requesting party is, who's involved. You may have to provide different documents if they exist. If it's a proposed arrangement, you might have draft documents or some sort of a detailed narrative description. And understandably, OIG is not going to issue advisory opinions to anonymous requesters. So you've got to designate a contact person, when you submit your request. And also, there's a cost associated with it, right? And so you can request sort of an estimate from OIG about how much it will cost you to do this. But to your point about the gamesmanship aspect of it, I think you're correct, right? It is that sometimes people want to go far enough in the process to get an answer. And if they don't like that answer at a very high level, they may find that it would be beneficial to their interests to withdraw the opinion or withdraw the request, which can be done at any point in time before the formal opinion is issued. So that does happen. Of course, I think it bears noting that just because you get an unfavorable advisory opinion doesn't necessarily mean that's the end of the world. It just means that OIG is not able to bless this particular set of facts. But you could still theoretically proceed with the arrangement, albeit cautiously, because as you mentioned, Jonathan, the key element to all of this is intent. right? And if you don't have the right intent, even if your arrangement doesn't sort of stack up the way OIG would like it to see, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's inherently wrong. And then, kind of with respect to competitors using the advisory opinion process to either undercut their rivals or to gain insight, I'm aware, at least anecdotally, that occurs. When you submit these advisory opinions, you have to make certain certifications or attestations about who you are and what you're doing and why you're making the request. So I suppose that you could submit these types of requests for opinions, but probably doing so with nefarious intent would require you to probably make some certifications or attestations that may not be 100% correct. I do know that does happen from time to time, from what I understand. But yeah, OIG's whole goal in doing these advisory opinions is, as they say, to provide meaningful guidance, right? I think they're trying to sort of stick to that goal.
So what I would say in terms of how the healthcare industry could get more certainty, I take it from the perspective of having done the in-house thing for majority of my legal career. The OIG advisory opinions, they average 15 a year, sometimes low, sometimes it's high. But those things are precedential in my world, where they come out and if anyone has the bad habit that I have of always checking OIG's website daily, just kind of see what's new. You see the advisory opinion and you kind of make a note in your head, okay, I need to read that today and kind of see where they're going. Because I tend to look at it, I imagine the same way a lot of practitioners do, as the OIG is wanting the healthcare industry to act in certain ways and not act in certain ways. And it communicates that in large part through its advisory opinions. And for the regulated community to act in kind, well, more advisory opinions would be better. And maybe, David, maybe you can speak a little bit to how many requests you get in versus how many opinions actually get generated, either favorable or not. But another one for folks like me is being able to take one of these opinions, because very, very rarely in my career is there an arrangement that is on all fours with any advisory opinion. Usually there's a fact that's off, and sometimes you can't conform the fact on my side with something that's in the opinion. So I would very much like, to the extent it would be feasible, for the OIG in writing these opinions to make them and to draft them so that they are almost inherently, you can extrapolate out against other similar or fact patterns. That would be immeasurably helpful for the industry, I think, as a whole.
Yeah, that sounds like it would be tremendously helpful. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, every time it's, top of mind for me, every time I see an OIG opinion come out, it's one of the first things I do in the morning is I'm looking at that opinion. Like Brett, I'm checking the OIG's website every day. And typically within a day or two, I've drafted some sort of a client alert that gets posted on our website that says, hey, provider community, just so you know, here's another new OIG opinion and here's how it might affect you. I think you're right, Brett, that rarely is a particular arrangement that I review going to hit on all cylinders with an advisory opinion. But again, sort of as I was mentioning, I think the healthcare attorneys in particular rely heavily on those opinions as a guidepost to help them fashion these types of arrangements in a way that, even if you can't get it squarely within the advisory opinions fact pattern, you're going to try to get as close as you can, right? Because that helps the client make an assessment as to whether or not, what's their risk tolerance and what's the likelihood of OIG kind of kicking over the hornet's nest on something like this, depending on the facts of the case. They, like you said, they issue, anywhere from 15 to 20 a year typically. By regulation, they're supposed to issue advisory opinions within 60 days, and they're supposed to at least have some sort of an initial assessment done within 10 days of receiving a formal request. Those calendars change depending on if OIG asks for more information and things like that. But I think the advisory opinion function and what it serves is instrumental to healthcare attorneys being able to advise their clients.
Yeah, I totally agree, David. And by the way, 60 days is also what Congress allows DOJ for making an intervention decision in qui tam. So sometimes 60 days means more. I'm with you there, David. And I think what we're all saying here is it'd be nice if things were just a little bit clearer for the industry, because I think the industry is full of people who think exactly like what Brett does, which is how do I help patients and how do I do that in a compliant way? And so, yeah, I'm hoping that what people can realize listening to this episode is there should be more clarity on just a lot of things. And it is a bit frustrating when you've got these advisory opinions that technically you can't rely on and yet are super helpful to people who are trying to find the right way forward. So let's shift gears a little bit and tell our listeners where we think healthcare is heading, both from a regulatory perspective and an enforcement one. Brett, when we were AHLA vice chairs together, we spent a bunch of time talking about the next big fraud and abuse issues coming. And so I'm hoping you could tell our listeners where you see the healthcare industry going in that respect. And then we'll let David close by telling us whether he can tell what's coming next from OIG, advisory opinions or guidance, and where he thinks healthcare enforcement is going. But we'll start with Brett.
So I say without an ounce of shame that I am a healthcare regulatory nerd. That's kind of the stuff that's always kind of been in the center of the fairway for me. Something that I am very interested to see how it's going to continue to play out is the erosion might be too strong of a word, but the fundamental reshaping of the administrative state with respect to healthcare regulation. Post Loper Bright, post even the Alina decision from even before that, is that going to cause the jettisoning of a lot of kind of the bulwark regulatory environment that practitioners like myself, both of you, and the overall community have kind of accepted as established practice? Maybe that doesn't end up being the case. And how does that connective tissue connect with False Claims Act enforcement and things like that? Regulations that have been on the books for quite some time that perhaps aren't the best reading of the underlying federal statute. How does that play out? So I'm very, very curious to see. That's probably the biggest thing on my bingo card, I'd say, going into the rest of this year and beyond.
David, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think on a more nuts and bolts level, what I would say is there's a huge uptick recently in CMS and DOJ looking at providers who are using skin substitute products. It is a big issue right now. The subject, a lot of audits and investigations. The consequences for providers operating in that space are huge, with clawbacks of millions of dollars for not that many patients and not that many dates of service. So I would envision that to continue to be on point for the rest of this year and into next year too. Just, sort of in my personal practice, we're seeing lots of providers coming to us looking for help to appeal these decisions. And so that's been keeping us rather busy these days. And then I think to your question, Jonathan, about what does the future hold? I mean, one of the questions that I get all the time as a former OIG attorney of recent vintage is, hey, what are they going to do next? And I don't have a crystal ball. I don't have one any more than you or Brett do. But what I can tell you is that the OIG is actually really transparent about what they're doing and where they're going. And so I know you guys are both consumers of OIG content. So it may not be a surprise to you to say that in addition to the advisory opinions, one of the things that I spend a lot of time looking at is the information that they put on their public-facing website. So whether it's the summaries of the self-disclosures that have been settled, whether it's settlement agreements under a CMPL or one of the DOJ settlements, OIG puts on their website all the time the audit reports, their audit work plans, the annual and semi-annual reports, right? All of these things indirectly should guide practitioners and providers in terms of what OIG is thinking, what's their sort of their thing of the moment, and also kind of where they may be going next. So that's what I always say is it's about as good a crystal ball as you'll get. But there is a lot of great content on OIG's website that I think informs sort of their next steps.
Yeah, so great insights from both of you. Thank you both so much for joining the podcast and telling our listeners about OIG advisory opinions and this murky road that the healthcare industry has to walk down. And so, Brett, David, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I think this has been great.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
To close, David's right. So skin substitutes is the next big thing coming. That's not even a secret at this point. I would expect a takedown on that. I think CMS announced earlier that they spent $10 billion on skin substitutes in 2024. That's almost 10x from recent years. And so it's stuff like that where we're going to continue to bring you information on this podcast about the future of healthcare enforcement and the future of False Claims Act enforcement. And so continue to listen to us. I also think a lot about how these advisory opinions interact with willfulness. We talked a little bit about that on this episode, and we'll continue to do that on the podcast because, when OIG says, look, this thing that someone is describing is technically a kickback, but it has minimal risk of fraud and abuse, I think people should be able to rely on that and demonstrate good faith through that. And so I think it's important now that you have lawyers who understand what willfulness means, who have talked to a jury about what willfulness means. And so if you don't have that, folks like David at Garfunkel Wilder are good options, and we've got some good ones here at Husch Blackwell as well. But I'm grateful for our listeners to paying attention to this episode. I think it was a good one. So thanks to David and Brett, and we'll see you next time.